I welcome you all warmly to this special event. My name is Patricia Purchert. I am Professor for Gender Studies and co-director of the Interdisciplinary Center of Gender Studies here in Bern. And it is a tremendous pleasure that we have Professor Anne Foster-Sterling here with us in Bern today. On behalf of my colleagues, I welcome her and her partner, Paula Vogel, wholeheartedly to the University of Bern. 2 years ago, in 2020, the Faculty of Humanities awarded an honorary doctorate to Anne Foster-Sterling. This mark of recognition was made because she is one of the most outstanding feminist scholars of our times. And more than this, she's also a courageous intellectual who has never been afraid to ask the most relevant, the most challenging, and sometimes painful questions concerning the way we think the body in a culture that is deeply invested in sexual difference and gender and racial hierarchies. At the Graduate School for Gender Studies here in Bern, Professor Foster-Sterling's texts are part of our regular reading list, and like us, generations of gender scholars around the world have learned from her how to look differently and more critically at the relation between biology, medicine, and the sexed body. However, Anne Foster-Sterling does not stop at a critical analysis of medical or biological knowledge. A biologist herself, she has taught us, as she writes in Myths of Gender, to see biology as part of the political struggle for more justice and equality. She has likewise shown how feminist, queer, and intersectional approaches need always to be part of biological and medical sciences. And this, she argues, is how scholars will come up with more accurate answers and more adequate tools to describe the bodily and social realities of gendered, sexed humans in our society. Ultimately, this is about establishing a less biased science, a science that reflects its own positionality and takes people's experiences, knowledges, and needs into account. In short, a better and more objective science. After the pandemic prevented us from coming together in person and celebrating Anne Foster-Sterling's honorary doctorate, we're all delighted to finally have the chance and do things properly, to offer a real celebration of Anne Foster-Sterling and her remarkable scholarship. In a moment, Professor Virginia Richter, Vice Rector of the University of Bern, will introduce Professor Foster-Sterling and her work to us. Following this, Professor Gabriela Rippel, Dean of the Faculty of Humanities, will read the Laudatio and hand over the honorary doctorate diploma. And Professor Anne Foster-Sterling will then deliver her lecture entitled Feminist Approaches to Science and Medicine, What Are They and Why Do They Matter? There will be a brief Q&A following the lecture, and afterwards you're all invited to join us for a celebratory moment just outside this lecture hall where drinks and snacks will be waiting. And this is also where, of course, any remaining questions can be discussed amongst us and with our special guest. And with this, I hand over to Vice Rector Virginia Richter.
Okay, thank you, Patricia. Dear Professor Foster-Sterling, dear Paula Vogel, dear Dean Rippel, dear colleagues, guests, and students, I'm joining Patricia in welcoming you all to this belated, monofactual little celebration in honor of Professor Foster Sterling. When that Dies Academicus had to be cancelled in 2020, the little group that had initiated or that had proposed Professor Foster Sterling's name was determined not to simply send her the document by mail, but really, as Patricia said, to celebrate it properly, however it would take. And it has taken a long time, but you're here, and we are so very, very happy that we can welcome you and Paula in person today. So, to my formal part of introducing, of course, somebody who doesn't need introducing. Anne Foster Sterling studied zoology at the University of Wisconsin and subsequently did her PhD in developmental genetics at Brown University. I hear myself having an echo. Is that better like this? Is it okay? Okay. So she studied zoology at the University of Wisconsin and subsequently did her PhD in developmental genetics at Brown University. Brown also remained her main academic affiliation throughout her distinguished career, from research associate to professor of medical science. From 2009 to 2014, she was Nancy Duke Lewis Professor of Biology and Gender Studies, also at Brown University, and she has continued her research as Professor Emerita to the present day. In addition, she was also a visiting professor at renowned centers of research such as the University of Amsterdam, SUNY, the University of Cincinnati, Mount Holyoke College, Radcliffe College, and the Stanford Humanities Center. So in short, Anne Foster Sterling is a biologist by vocation and training. This is insofar remarkable as she is about to receive the Doctor Honoris Causa from the Faculty of Humanities. To date, this honor has been awarded to eminent scholars such as the linguists Émile Benveniste and Monika Heller, the art historian Georges Didier Huberman, the writer Georges Arthur Goldschmidt, to philosophers, historians, social anthropologists, artists, creative writers, but not, to my knowledge, to scientists. As you will hear from the Dean shortly, one main reason for the nomination has been the transdisciplinary nature of her work, her programmatic crossing of the divide between the sciences and humanities, which Patricia also has mentioned. Despite titles such as Studies on the Sterility Phenotype of the Mutant Fused of Drosophila melanogaster, her very first publication in the Journal of Experimental Zoology, Anne Foster Sterling quickly moved from the study of flies to the vast field of gender studies, where she has established herself as one of the most important innovators and perhaps disruptors of received truths. Her main publications in this field include the already mentioned Myth of Gender, Biological Theories about Women and Men, which was published in 1985, Sexing the Body, Gender Politics and the Construction of Sexuality, first published in 2000 and recently reissued in a revised edition with an additional chapter in 2020. And finally, Sex, Gender, Biology in a Social World in 2012. While these books are deeply embedded in her research, naturally, they also reach out beyond an expert scientific readership to a wider community of readers interested in the question how we become who we are, how our sexualities and identities are constructed in a process of nature-culture co-emergence. With an increasingly hostile debate about biological determination versus social construction, Anne Foster Sterling proposes a processual understanding of the gender-sex identity complex. Building on a model of embodied culture, she understands identity not as a fixed trait, a given resulting from genes, hormones, and so on, but as a stable process in which bodily developments and cultural practices are co-constitutive for gender-sex identity. This implies that while identity can be stable at any given moment of personal development, it is not static, fixed, or predetermined, but always a dynamic process. A further implication and a challenge to what she calls the standard framing of psychological studies is a departure from the assumption that binary gender identity is the norm. For Anne Foster Sterling, there is no such thing as a core gender identity resulting from a normal process, which therefore doesn't require further examination, implying that all other forms of identity are somehow deviant and disorderly. For Anne Forster Sterling, all paths we take in our individual development require to be studied and explained by a single process. Her research, especially her recent work on the early interactions between small children and their carers, brings back to our ken the whole spectrum of gender sex. And if I can now slip into a more personal mode, Patricia also mentioned the generations who have been influenced by Anne Forster Sterling's work. And of course, I belong to one of these generations. When I did my PhD worked on my PhD for a long time in the 1990s, a decade that was very much dominated by Judith Butler. Of course, I was also under the sway of Butler, as we all were then, but I always felt a sense that the way she writes about the body is somehow elusive and there is something missing. And then I then came across Sexing the Body, really by chance, I think so, and really shortly after it had been published. It's as if the door had opened literally and there was light and air suddenly. So for me, that was one of the transformative readings as a young scholar. So thank you very much for that. In the preface to the new edition of Sexing the Body, Anne Forster Sterling wrote, "My biggest desire in writing this book is to stimulate discussion and reading on the part of my readers. With the other organizers of this event, Patricia Purchett, Annelies Kaiser-Trujillo, and Crispin Thurlow, I hope that tonight's public lecture will stimulate discussion, reading of Anne Forster Sterling's works first and foremost, of course, and thinking, and perhaps doubt, about what we consider self-evident truth." And with that, I hand over to our Dean, Gabi Rippel.
Well, let me just briefly repeat, also in the name of our faculty, that it's such an immense honor and pleasure to have you here in person, and that you really were able to accept our honorary doctorate in 2020. Good to have you here. Here is the official laudatio. The laudatio to the Doctoris Philosophiae Honoris Causa Anne Forster Sterling for being a pioneering scholar whose internationally renowned work bridges the natural sciences and the humanities, for her groundbreaking contributions to gender studies, especially the biological and socio-cultural constitution of gender, and Forster Sterling, who has called for the critical interrogation of biologisms and other received ideas, for her cutting-edge research, which is of relevance to numerous disciplines in our faculty, who fearlessly stands up as a public intellectual against prejudice, reductionism, and fake news. So, dear Professor Forster Sterling, this is the official document, which is all yours now. I hope you can carry it home with you. Yes, well, if not, we try to send it across the Atlantic. Well, wonderful. I don't know whether we are in the shaking hands moment. Okay, so congratulations. We're very proud. Thank you. Oh.
Thank you all so much. I'm truly honored by this occasion and delighted with, so pleased by all the work a number of you have put in to get me here and to make the occasion work to begin with in 2020, when it was clear it was going to be a distant event. So I specifically want to thank Patricia Purchett, Annelies Kaiser, Corbinian Seitz, who was a miracle for getting all of the technical, the hotels and the air tickets and the COVID tests that I need to get back to the States, all of those things. Crispin Thurlow and Virginia Richter, I can't thank you enough for for making this possible and for honoring me in this way. So it's just a pleasure to be here, to hit good weather. And I want to begin with offering you my thoughts about feminist approaches to science and medicine. What are they and why do they matter? So I'm going to start a while back and sort of bring you into the present. About 25 years after feminists began to bang at the doors of science and medicine, an historian of science named Londa Schiebinger asked the following question. She asked, has feminism changed science? So that was a book that she wrote about, as I said, about 25 years ago. And I'll start with an historical introduction to then turn, that will then lead us back to my answer to that question. And the historical is also quite personal, and so I will be weaving my own experiences into this. So in 1969, which was before I know a lot of you were born, tired of inattentive medical treatment, women in the United States took matters into their own hands. They produced this book, which called Women and Their Bodies, A Course, and as you can see, it was made of newsprint, and it sold for 75 cents, and it was published by an organization called the New England Free Press, and we, including myself, got boxes of it and stood on the street corner and sold it to passersby. And I would get a box of 50 copies, and in an hour, they would be gone. This Women and Their Bodies was put together by this organization, this group of people, the Boston Women's Health Collective. They were mostly not physicians. They were lay people, some health professionals, but it mostly was a group of women who was like, we want to know what's happening. And it was, as it turns out, quite a remarkable document. The table of contents of this first edition was incredibly thorough. It went from our changing sense of self, the anatomy and physiology of reproduction and sexuality, discussions of sexuality itself, living with ourselves, 2 chapters on gay relationships. And remember, this was 1969, so this was pretty forward-looking. Moving on, this is still a table of contents of what they covered. A chapter on nutrition, chapter on women in motion and exercises, chapters on rape, self-defense, venereal disease, birth control. Moving along, and you notice that a lot of these are still relevant. Abortion, deciding whether to have children, chapters on childbearing, and these are all very detailed technical chapters, on what pregnancy is, how it works. They were informing women who did not have access to information about the basic processes of their bodies. And then, lastly, just get this up here. Chapters on a chapter on menopause and a chapter on women and healthcare, and all sorts of things about health issues with the body. So this was quite an extraordinary enterprise put together by lay people and sold on the street corner. The publication was groundbreaking. It focused on women's bodies and emphasized functions such as childbirth, menstruation, and menopause that were rarely at the time addressed directly or accurately by the medical profession. It was comprehensive and it was interdisciplinary. It was what we call one-stop shopping, the supermarket for your body. And nothing like that had ever been done before. It empowered women to take charge of their own medical care and to make informed choices. When, again, they were not able to get clear answers from their physicians. So the book grew, and it continued to spread throughout the world. There were, over a period of decades, 9 US editions. There were spin-offs, such as Our Bodies, Ourselves, a whole book dedicated to pregnancy and birth. Ourselves and Our Children, a book by and for parents, and you can tell by the covers which were the older ones and which were the newer ones, because at some point it stopped being produced in newsprint and was taken over by a publisher with a proper publishing method. Changing Bodies and Changing Lives. I bought this for my nephew when he was a teenager to help him understand better what was happening as he went through puberty and young adulthood. Our Bodies and Ourselves, a whole book devoted to menopause, and Ourselves Growing Older, a body that addressed the process of aging for women. So there were all of these spin-offs that came out one after another over a period of a couple of decades. And there was globalization. This movement became part of a worldwide movement. And if we just look at this for a minute, you can see that there were, and there still are, oops, let's try that again. There we go. Translations, there are ongoing Our Bodies, Ourselves projects all over the world, translations into all of these languages. And also with groups in the USA. So in the US, Farsi, in the US, Latin America, in Spanish, all sorts of things. We were invited. I was invited to speak in Turkey about 4 years ago to celebrate the start of their of the Turkish language version of Our Bodies, Ourselves. So this continues until recently. There was even a copy or an edition written in the German language. That continued. It was published through several editions, and I think the last edition was in 1996. So it was just this huge success in it, and it continues to be, even as the collective itself has aged and has moved into a new phase of its own existence. So this daring act by feminist laypeople permanently changed the practice of medicine, and that's one of the points of the talk, really. And I'm going to get back to that, but as we say in the US Western movies, meanwhile, back at the ranch, there were other things happening in the US. Until the 1970s, US medical schools had an informal admissions quota. Women got 3 to 5% of the seats in each entering class. So consider that I got my PhD in 1970. That would mean, had I applied to medical school, those would have been my odds that 95% of the admittees would have been men, 5% at the most would have been women, of whom I perhaps could have been one. But it was a small number, and there were similar quotas for African Americans. There were similar quotas for Jews. This was really a Christian white male enterprise into the 1970s. Before 1964, fewer than 3% of students entering US medical schools were Black, Puerto Rican, Native American, or Mexican American, for example. But then enter feminist militancy and the civil rights movements, and these led to some very important social changes, and especially to changes in graduate school admissions and also medical schools. So I was, again, on the early edge of being admitted to graduate school at a time when there were still quotas for women entering graduate school. Then as we reached the late 60s, early 1970s, things changed very dramatically. Big events happened that really shook things up. The civil rights movement in the US rocked the nation. The anti-Vietnam War movement exploded, and the so-called second wave feminism emerged. And these were all things that were joined at the hip, as we say. These were not separate events. These were all part of the whole growth of a new left movement in the United States, with different branches that intersected. All of these things led, among other things, to the passage of the US Civil Rights Act in 1965, which forbade discrimination on the basis of race. And in 1972, the act was extended. The Congress did it as sort of a joke, but they thought, well, if we have civil rights, we might as well have them for women too, why not? But in 1972, this was extended to include women in education, giving for the first time the US government the authority to forbid discrimination against women and minorities in any institution receiving federal funds. And the effects on admissions were rapid. The changes were, and the fact that admissions changed also led to other rather profound changes. For example, in medicine, just one field of medicine, in 1975, only 16% of obstetrics and gynecology residents were women. So this was one of the main fields, obviously, that treats women and their bodies with things that are specifically having to do with female physiology. And it was a minority field for women physicians. By 1986, that number had risen to 51%. So by that time, half of the gynecologists' residents had become women, and most recently that number has gone up to 83%. So there's been a complete flip, so that now most of the residents, the young doctors in training, and up quite a ways through the hierarchy of the doctors who are in the field of obstetrics and gynecology are women rather than men. And that's a direct result of a feminist movement which led to a change in the legal system and the enforcement of anti-discrimination laws in the United States in the area of higher education. And the work of Our Bodies, Ourselves filtered into mainstream medicine. There was better care, there was new research and knowledge produced, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. But for example, organizations that were founded as women physicians became trained and part of the medical profession. An organization called the Society for Women's Health Research was formed that actually sought to learn more about women's bodies, to open up areas of ignorance and to shed light on them. They founded a journal which is current today as well, called the Journal of Women's Health, which publishes peer-reviewed research articles on women and their bodies. Shortly after the Journal of Women's Health, which is a somewhat more basic science research, a new foundation was formed called the Foundation for Gender-Specific Medicine. And this organization has a journal also, the Journal of Gender-Specific Medicine, which is the official journal of the partnership of this women's health organization and the Columbia Medical School. So these two journals themselves marked a new moment in producing academic work that was important for knowing more about women's bodies and gender and health in general. So I want to give you a quick sample of a few of the things we have learned. This is like we could spend a course actually studying all the new information we've gained, but this will be a quick sample. So before this kind of literature started being looked at, it was thought that heart disease was mostly a disease of men, and these were the symptoms that one looked at for heart disease. So someone comes to an emergency room and they have chest discomfort or an irregular heartbeat, or they're feeling dizzy. They might be suspected that there's a heart attack, further measures are taken to mitigate that. But it turns out that women were diagnosed less often because women turn out to have a different set of symptoms. And so after people started saying, well, what symptoms do women present with when they have heart disease? It turns out that they have some of the same things, chest pressure, but they may also have things that were dismissed as being just, a silly woman, like anxiety and sleep disturbances, or back, neck, arm, or jaw pain. So as these symptoms became recognized, so too did the existence of heart disease in women that had previously gone unrecognized. And so it turns out that men don't have greater frequency of heart disease than women, but rather they're rather similar. But it's still true that women's disease is often more advanced when it's diagnosed because it hasn't been recognized early enough, because the set of symptoms are different. There are similar kinds of things showed up in when AIDS diagnosis became prominent. Before, AIDS was initially seen as a disease of gay men. I think we all know that that's an incorrect accounting of AIDS these days, but it was thought that women didn't get it, that it was only transmitted through gay sex. There were, and except for the few unfortunate good AIDS patients who got it because they were hemophiliacs or something, there was this whole hierarchy of who was a good, wasn't an amoral person, and who you could feel sorry for them. But it turns out that that women involved with treating and diagnosing AIDS began to recognize that that women got AIDS too, but that the disease pattern again they had was very different. So, and it was mostly symptoms of chronic HIV in women involve recurrent yeast infections, vaginal ulcers, abnormal periods. None of these are things men have because they don't have these body parts. So it took, again, a lapse of about, 5 to 10 years before AIDS as a pandemic, an epidemic in women became recognized. And again, it was because there were now women in the healthcare professions that had not been there 20 years ago who began to recognize these other patterns. And you would think that between Aristotle, Galen, Da Vinci, Vesalius, and all the 19th and 20th century anatomists, we would know pretty much what there is to know about anatomy. But it turns out that only after women scientists began really studying anatomy did we learn some pretty fundamental things. So consider these headlines. This first one from 2022, this year, called Textbook Typologies, Challenging the Myth of the Perfect Obstetric Pelvis. And I think, yeah. So in this article, this researcher who's an anatomist, Carolyn von Sickle, and who was trained, she was the first postdoc at a new postdoctoral program at the University of Wisconsin that specifically calls for bringing together gender and science in a formally funded way, in the way that that I started out informally and that a few other people before me did. But this program funds a postdoc to do this kind of work, and Carolyn von Sickle was the first one to do this work, to have this postdoc. It was 4 years ago, I think, that maybe 6 that she was hired. And what she studies is pelvic anatomy, comparative pelvic anatomy, and what she's and she studies it in anthropologically in Neanderthal skeletons, but also in modern skeletons. And her conclusions is that the traditional obstetrics is based basically on a kind of mythology of the perfect pelvis, the Aristotelian pelvis, as you were, that really is just not correct and doesn't take into proper account the kind of variety that exists in female bodies. And so in this article, they call for an evidence-based practice of obstetrics based on an understanding of the complexity and variability of the physiology of pregnancy and birth, instead of using false typologies. So that's one example, quite recent. Another example, an article called The Homunculus, What is Known About the Representation of the Female Body in the Brain. And this is a paper that, and there have been a couple of these together, but that sums up some of the recent results on looking at the localization of sensory features of the body, and how if you touch something on the fingers, where that transports to and where it registers in the cortex of your brain. And the classic studies of these were the production by a scientist called Wilder Penfield, who studied patients. When was Penfield? It was in the 30s, 40s, I think. And he mapped both male and female patients, but the only maps he produced, which were what he called the homunculus, and there are these, you've probably seen them, I didn't reproduce a picture here, but these weird pictures of a cross-cut of the cerebral cortex with different parts of it exaggerated or smaller, depending, showing what part of the cortex the sensory part of the body mapped onto. But he didn't map the female body. So his iconic map of the homunculus shows clearly a male brain or a male body with testicles and a penis and no breasts. So recently, what's happened is that people have started to try to do a similar map for the female brain, and Gillian Einstein, one of the authors of this paper, and others have called it the hermunculus instead of the homunculus. And basically in this review article, what they write is that there's still an awful lot we don't know about how the entire female body is represented in the brain, or how it might change. And this is the other thing, nothing developmental in the homunculus. So how it might change with different reproductive life stages, hormones, and experiences. So is the somatosensory cortex of the brain the same in a teenager girl compared to someone who has given birth, compared to someone who is postmenopausal? There's no developmental information on the changing anatomy of the brain and of the somatosensory cortex. So this is an example of the kind of new knowledge that having women scientists and women physicians doing research is starting to produce. Or this, which is kind of fun.
Do you recognize the shape above me? Kind of an alien, penguin, spaceship, maybe? Well, not exactly. It's something called the clitoris. So by the 20th century, we had a picture of the clitoris, but it was all in bits and pieces. Part of the problem was we literally didn't have images of the clitoris. We only had MRI images of the clitorises of dead, older women. So an Australian urologist named Helen O'Connell set out to change that. In the 1990s, she performed the first MRI images of the clitorises of living, aroused women. And basically what she found when she published her paper in 2005 was that the clitoris is 10 times bigger than most people thought. But it wasn't just size. This organ was intimately connected to the urethra, where your urine comes out, and to the vagina, the stretchy tube. So O'Connell suggested a new term. She called it the clitoral complex.
So the author here, I think it said it in the beginning, is Rachel Gross, and she has a brand new book out called Vagina Obscura. And the clitoris, there's one chapter on the clitoris in it. And this is a longer, it's a 1 minute extracted from a 20-minute talk that she gives. It's quite nice and gives the historical background. But the point is that a major part of female anatomy just was not understood and is only beginning to be understood. And again, I think Helen McConnell is a trained urologist. Urology was one of those fields that was closed to women within medicine until fairly recently. So again, I'm making this link between the feminist push to open up fields to female practitioners and the changing kinds of knowledge that we have. There. And I put this up because it's not as if the medical world was going ahead and saying, well, we don't know about the clitoris, so we won't touch it. No, in fact, the clitoris was a central part of treatment for intersex children. So the operations done, and I write about this in Sexing the Body, the operations done on children who were born with ambiguous genitalia often involved either removing the clitoris or resecting it, and with the claim that it had no effect on sexual function or later development. And the idea was that, or on orgasm, and the idea was that the clitoris was just basically what could be seen on the outside. And what we know now is that that the clitoris is an organ that's primarily buried. Only about 10% of it is visible on the exterior, and the rest of it is internal. So medical practice into the present has been done in the ignorance of actual knowledge about the anatomical knowledge. So changes in STEM, that is science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, diversity, also wrought critiques of the basic sciences. So it's not just the medical sciences that have changed. If we look at this, let me see if I can get this up, magnify this again. Here we go. So if you see here the dates, these are percents of PhDs offered, received in different years, starting from 1973 to 2010 in different fields. I haven't written in all of the fields, but I've written in psychology, the life sciences, math and computer sciences, engineering is the bottom curve. What you see is that the most you had in psychology was 18 or 20% in 1973, and that number has just risen dramatically to equity in 2010. When I was a graduate student at Brown, the psychology department admitted to their graduate school, to their PhD studies, the top 10 men and the top 5 women. So, and that was an admitted policy. That was before Title IX, this feature of the law that I mentioned earlier, came into being, and that became a forbidden practice, and they had to admit the top 10 best students, whether they were men or women. And what happened was a major change in the structure of the field. In my field of life sciences, when I entered graduate school, I entered graduate school out here. But by the time I was a young assistant professor, it was still maybe about 10% in life sciences, and now it's increased to 25 or 30%. It still hasn't reached equity, but it's much better than it was. So tremendous changes over a period of years in the percentage of PhDs as men or women in these fields. Oh wait, I think I skipped something. Let's see. So it's not just gender that matters, though, and this is an important point for me. The number of African Americans earning PhDs in this period were tiny. And this is just an example from earning PhDs in physics. The years these are grouped years starting from 1977 to 1982, groups of 5. These are not percentages. I want you to understand. These are absolute numbers of people receiving PhDs in the United States in a 5-year period. So from 1977 to 1982, 1 African-American woman received a PhD in physics in the United States, compared to about 41 men, still not very many. But there was this huge gender disparity within also an unbelievable racial disparity. And we see that the numbers have improved. They're still not brilliant. And the gender disparity has lessened. So instead of 41 to 1, it's now 60 to 20. So it's still a gender disparity, but it's still quite real. And again, we're in 2022, and you'd think maybe things are better, but they're not a lot better. That increase kind of has leveled off and maybe even decreased a little bit currently. So you have also this example, and you might wonder, well, why does it matter how many African Americans get PhDs in physics? And this is the kind of thing that you see happening. This is from a current Brown University newsletter, and it features a young woman who's a PhD student in physics, and obviously she's African American, and she's working on a project to correct skin color bias in pulse oximeters. Now, pulse oximeters are those little gizmos. We've maybe become too familiar with them during COVID, that measure how much oxygen is getting into your blood. And they work really well if you have a light skin color, and they work very poorly if your skin color is dark, because the kind of wavelength that's used to detect the blood color underneath the skin doesn't work on darker skin colors. So it's an inaccurate measure for people of color. And what this woman is working on is trying to develop a pulse oximeter that will work for people with different skin colors. And this has come to light recently in a lot of less concerning ways. So we go into the airport and we wave our hands. I wave my hands under a hand detector and the soap comes out. Well, if you have a dark skin colored hand, it's much less likely that that light will detect your hand. And this has been very much in the news. These things that seem like run-of-the-mill kind of activities that we take into account don't work well across the board, across the spectrum of human diversity. And it takes people of color in the sciences both to know that that's true and to think it's important enough to begin to do a research project on it. So that's the kind of reason that diversity really matters. This is just an example. Since the Black Lives Matter movement started, after the murder of Floyd George, you began to have all of these different headlines in the US and abroad of discovering ways in which algorithms were biased, gender biased in AI, overcoming racial bias in AI, millions of Black people affected by racial bias in healthcare algorithms, the discovery of racial bias when it comes to gorillas. Google Photos remains blind. Google Photos was pulling, if you tried to get photos of Black people, it would also pull up photos of gorillas. I mean, really things that make you crazy if you think about it, but that were just not noticed until the whole Black Lives Matter exploded. And then the scientists who worked in these areas began to call out some of the problems. So let me give you a few examples of how gender matters in science, as well as in medicine. This is the first example. The women who revolutionized primatology. The field of primatology was dramatically changed by the incoming of particularly particularly well-known scientists, Jane Goodall, Diane Fossey, and Birute Galdikas. And I think probably many of you in the room have heard of at least some of these women, if not all of them. And what they did was completely revolutionize the study of primates in the field. They did this by developing new methods. They developed intimacy with study subjects. They learned to recognize individuals in the truths that they studied, and they tracked multiple generations. So they learned to recognize the animals. They gave them names. They knew whose daughter and whose son was whose, and they could track the entire structure of troops across generations. And these steps became the fundamental methods of behavioral field science in general, and they're seen in the monumental studies of Clutton-Brock on the red deer, or the 40-year-long longitudinal studies of baboons in Amboseli, and any number of other examples that I could bring up. So you have women enter a field and completely change it, and completely change behavioral field science as a whole by their different insights, by their willingness to personalize, to individualize, and to study longitudinally. So that's one example. They generated many books, these women primatologists. A few of them, I used to teach this book, Primate Paradigms, by Linda Marie Fadigan, who worked on Japanese macaques. This Primate Encounters is a collection of books, of articles by women primatologists in different fields of primatology. Primate Visions, which will be well known to a lot of you, by Donna Haraway, also address this question of how new knowledge about primates is produced, and she does it in this, profound and broad historical and contemporary context. And this book, which is another collection called Feminism and Evolutionary Biology, Boundaries, Intersections, and Frontiers, by Patricia Adair Gowady, who studied not primates, but bluebirds, and studied mating systems in bluebirds and showed how they were not that traditional binary, the males have a field and they dominate and they defend the nest, but showed how it depended on the context of the nesting variety, the nesting sites that were available, whether the males primarily were defensive aggressors or whether they actually were helpmates in tending the nest together. So this kind of work in behavioral biology has really changed how we view the world. Another example, this is how gender binary limit, how the gender binary limits archaeological study. This is a pretty recent article from Science magazine, and this paper briefly discusses problems in starting archaeological analyses from an assumed binary in gender, and says when you start with the binary assumption, then you predict a certain kind of data, and again emphasizes a different statistical methodology. It doesn't reject statistics, but it says you have to use a statistics that starts from a neutral standpoint, and especially when monitoring or processing large data sets, you let the data set use the statistics to let the data set tell you what's there, rather than coming in with a set of hypotheses and asking the data set to fit into your preconceived notions. So they should be investigated using multivariate statistical techniques. And when they did this, they found that at these large grave sites where there were loads of skeletons that they were measuring, that things were actually quite a bit more complicated. And it wasn't just if you saw a bracelet that meant the skeleton was female, because there were apparently males who were buried with bracelets and females who were buried with spears. And clearly the gender life of the people in these cemeteries, or when they had been alive, was a lot more complicated than a simple binary. So one of the aspects of doing feminist science is really getting the science right. And by developing new methods, by asking questions that haven't been asked, by looking in places that haven't been looked at. Getting the science right, I'm arguing, is a feminist enterprise. And I'll give you 3 current undertakings, organizations that are working to do that. The first of these actually is located or started in Switzerland, I think it's fair to say, and it's called a Neurogendering Network. And it's a transdisciplinary network of neurofeminist scholars who aim to critically examine the production of neuroscientific knowledge and to develop better approaches to this work. Some of the kind of things they've done, these are just examples from this network, from the scientists in this network, producing new knowledge through innovative research and critique. For example, let's get this. This is from a paper that a group published a few years ago called Researching Spatial Stuff, that started to ask questions about what I would call the kind of mythology within cognitive science that men have better spatial abilities than women. And when they began to research it, what they found was that there were things you needed to look at that weren't looked at within the traditional cognitive studies, and that they worked together in a complex network, not in a linear thing. And so you have cognition, but that's also linked to social experience. It is linked to the brain. There are hormones involved with the brain structure and activity. There are behaviors that are also linked to social experience. So you have different social experiences through behaving in different ways, through going to different locations, to seeing different things. So the object of this article was to improve the practices for investigating what they called spatial stuff. And that word stuff used on purpose because the notion of spatial abilities was so fungible. It turned into anything you wanted to in an argument. So someone would say, well, spatial abilities, that has to do with being able to rotate a figure in your head. And then that immediately became women are not as good at mathematics. And there was no clear line as to why the one led to the other. And anytime you try to pin down what it meant, it became something else. So it became, I think, as the women who were writing this paper and having the discussions that led up to it, discussed it, what they found was that they couldn't just call it a single thing, and they used this nice word stuff, which covers a lot of stuff. So another example published by someone in the neurogendering network is an article on biological studies, which often interpret sex-based data, misinterpret sex-based data. Another book published by one of the members is a book called Molecular Feminisms, Biology, Becomings, and Life in the Lab by another member of this network. And these are all very recent. Debelina's book is a couple years old, I think. So this is an area of great productivity, and helped by, and yet one more study by another member of the network on revealing doing a meta-analysis of studies that supposedly show brain differences between men and women, and finding out that there really aren't so many of them. So this is an ongoing organization. It's a network of scholars who meet together on a pretty regular basis, who communicate through a listserv, who discuss these issues and support work in different areas. So it's an ongoing network. And I really like this last one, 8 things you need to know about sex, gender, brains, and behavior, because it's a how-to for scientists who are not necessarily trained in feminist approaches, who are like, well, yeah, we'd like to do better, but what does it mean to do a feminist research project? And this was published in one of the Frontiers journals. I don't remember if it was Cognitive Science or which, but it's a how-to for scientists who want to do better, but don't necessarily know. So 8 things you need to consider about sex, gender, brains, and behavior. So it's also a move not only to produce their own new knowledge, but to also help current scientists do better at their own work. Another organization called the Gender Science Lab comes out of Harvard University. It was founded by philosopher of science Sarah Richardson. And again, this is a platform for innovation collaboration. It brings together gender scholars and biomedical science to build new theories and methods. And it also tries to be intersectional in its approach. And just again, a few examples. An article published recently in Cell Reports Medicine, why sex as a biological variable conflicts with precision medicine initiatives. So it's a critical look at this notion of precision medicine and what some of the problems for it might be. This article, The Future of Sperm, a biovariability framework for understanding global sperm counts. There's a lot in the news, and there's been a lot published about declining sperm counts in men globally. And there are a lot of theories about what caused it, not a lot of really good data. And this is an article that tries to provide a different kind of framework for understanding it. And then a very recent article, they've been very active during COVID, trying to get better data on COVID. And in this one, they point out that there is no COVID-19 data on trans and gender expansive people, and they're calling for including them, because the COVID studies on sex and gender have been really binary. There are men and there are women, and we can look at them, but looking at the trans population or the non-binary population has just not been part of research on COVID, and this article makes the case that has to change. And then last, Londa Schiebinger herself. Remember, I started with Londa Schiebinger, and she's still active. She wrote that book 25 years ago, Has Feminism Changed Science? And now, and a number of years ago, she started her own research clearinghouse that she calls Gendered Innovations. And these are a few of the things that, if we look at the general method, even so, it's hard to see. I know it's tiny, but if the things that she looks at, say, under general methods, rethinking research priorities, analyzing sex, analyzing gender. And under each of these are actually hyperlinked to lists of articles and lists of approaches, specific field methods, health and biology, evolutionary biology, all areas where work is ongoing, and where she's providing this clearinghouse for scientists who are in these fields who want to continue to do this kind of work. More of these case studies she publishes. This is still part of her clearinghouse. And I'm putting this up here because I want to give you a sense of the variety of work that's out there, the variety of new knowledge that's being addressed, and the scope. So it's not just having to do with female body parts, but it's going through all areas of health and medicine and biology, and into engineering, the environment, AI, all of these kinds of things. All of these areas of study are now being affected by gender methodology, and in this research clearinghouse, Londa is logging in the information. So, feminist approaches to science and medicine. What are they? Well, they're asking first if gender sex matters, exposing bad and incomplete science. That's part of what they do. They're asking about appropriate methods, filling in areas of ignorance, and developing new methodology. These are all aspects of feminist approaches to science and medicine. And why do they matter? Obviously, equity and justice, both individual and societal, are a critical reason that they matter. So it matters that people in general be able to study what they want to study and produce the kind of knowledge they want to produce. And it matters for society that a diversity of knowledge gets produced. I argue that we make better science when we have diverse scientists and diverse theory producing science. So there's more knowledge and there's more nuance as a result of feminist approaches. So has feminism changed science and medicine, health and engineering, and the environment? Obviously, my answer is yes, and I want to close by talking a little bit about how this looks. Years ago, when philosophers of science and those of us who were feminist scientists who were just trying to figure this out, and trying to figure out what it meant to be objective. So the argument would be made to us that you don't need more women necessarily. Yes, it's nice, but you don't need them because science is objective, and the knowledge will be the same regardless of who's producing it, because science is abstracted from culture. And so part of the work of philosophers of science in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, people like Sandra Harding, people like Helen Longino, people like Evelyn Fox Keller, was to produce an idea of objectivity that was not quite so absolute. And instead, they began to conceptualize scientific knowledge as, first of all, knowledge existing about the world. And some of it we know how to study. Some of it we don't. So the part that we don't know how to study is kind of faded in the background here. We don't know what it is yet, but we periodically learn to study it. I mean, we didn't know about black holes 80 years ago, but now we do, and we're studying them. But the part that we can study, that we know how to study, is represented on this blackboard. And so the argument is that at the beginning, say in 1970, at the beginning of the feminist science movement, you had primarily men, or in this case, the image I got was of a young boy looking quite sure of himself with his bow tie. And he was studying science, and he was explicating with considerable objectivity all of the material that shows on the board. But there's more on this blackboard that he just can't see. And so as you begin to incorporate women, people of color, more aspects of science come under study and come into focus that are accessible now by our current methods, but nobody has applied the right methodology or thought to study them. And you can see where this is going. As you get women, white women as well, or I've chosen images of children, but more of the board gets filled in. And if you, young boys of color or men of color help to fill in still other parts of it. And you begin to have a fuller picture. The full objectivity comes of the knowledge that we know how to access comes from a more diverse workforce, a more diverse intellectual force. And so that's the message I want to leave you with, is this notion of how feminist science, the move to increase people of color in science, has expanded the kind of knowledge that we have access to here, and presumably someday we will begin to also look at things that are off the blackboard right now, but that we don't know how to access, or maybe we don't even know exist, but we will find out. So it's a progressive process. The more different kinds of people you have working on it, the more that detail on that blackboard fills in. And so that's what I have to tell you about why feminist science matters. Okay.
Yeah, dear Anne Fassel-Sterling, thank you so much for this really encompassing and rich talk. You took us to a tour to so many places, so many knowledges. It was really a privilege to have this tour from you, of all people.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I found it really, I mean, there is so many interesting aspects, like the way you reminded us of how, you know, the feminist health movements were important for, that started in the late 60s, early 70s, were important for what we do now. And then also the way you could show us how, like, access to science, if women and people of color have access to science, that really does change the way science is done, and the way questions are asked or methods are, you know, changed. And I think that's such an important relation. And that was, you know, thank you so much for bringing that out so clearly. We have time for a couple of questions, and you're invited to.
Is my favorite part. So, yes.
First of all, thank you so much. I'll echo what some other people said. I also read your book, Sexing the Body, in my bachelor's degree, and it's what made me want to be a gender studies major. So, thank you.
You're welcome.
I'm wondering about, like, all of this data that you had also about women being involved in the sciences and people of color. Is there that kind of data already on trans people, non-binary people, intersex people?
I think that we're starting to see, I'm starting to see, certainly in contemporary literature, how having non-binary people working in the sciences and social sciences starting to change data collection in some pretty interesting ways. There are a number of new journals that have that are forming within the field of psychology. I'm really bad at remembering the journal titles now, if I haven't known it for 100 years already. But there are a number of new journals that are focused on sexual orientation and non-binary development, and they're developing new methods so that involve, I mean, they are methods that have existed in the world, but they're applying them in different ways. So, and so is Londa in some of her work. For example, I was telling some people about this earlier. The study of gender dysphoria, which is now what trans people are defined as within the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual version 5. So transgender has moved from sort of out of a disease category into, and it's been renamed. And now it's called, and now it's just an aspect of being transgender called gender dysphoria that is seen as something that is treatable as a mental difficulty, if not a mental illness. And it has a very strict definition that comes from the psychiatrists, who, by the way, got their definitions from trans people who went to them and said, you have to treat us. So there's a really interesting traffic of knowledge from starting with Harry Benjamin and trans people in the 30s and 40s who went to him and to others and said, you have to address these problems because they're real and they're serious. But then they got medicalized in a particular way. And gender dysphoria got medicalized simply as a disconnect between sex identified at birth and the mental belief or identity of one's identity. But there are now studies being done. There's a recent study of a survey done of trans teenagers or non-binary teenagers in a Canadian health survey. And instead of simply coming in with a definition of dysphoria, they did a qualitative study in which they got the participants in this survey, which is a national survey in Canada, to identify, use their words to identify what they felt. And that's a bottom-up instead of a top-down approach to getting knowledge. And what comes out of that study, which again, it's only a couple years old, is a whole description of dysphoria that is so different from what's in the DSM. It involves physical symptoms, physiological symptoms. It's not just emotional. It's whatever it is that's emotional in it has a physical outcomes. And it does include, which is the publicized part of it, the suicidal ideation, but there are all of these physiological symptoms as well that completely change how you might think about dysphoria as a, quote, as a problem that needs treatment and what kind of problem it is. And that's by asking the people who are experiencing it to describe it and building your theory from what they have to say. So there's a lot of that going on in the new methodology where people are addressing the medical issues that trans and non-binary people are currently experiencing. Londa did a similar kind of thing, similar to that study of the grave sites using large data sets, saying how can we operationalize what gender means in a medical study, and instead of just what usually statistically is done is you factor it out, you control for it, but instead of controlling for it, she's like, what is it? What do we think it is? And again, she and her team interviewed people about how gender affected their lives, what they considered, what gender meant for them as they were part of some other health study. So I think there's a really interesting movement now to get your data from the people who are experiencing the issues being studied, rather than going in with a preset account and trying to fit the people in by giving them a questionnaire with 2 choices or 3 choices, but rather, Sari van Anders, who's studying sexuality in multiple dimensions, does something similar. She has really, I still have a hard time understanding her diagrams, but it's a 3-dimensional cone with circles around it, and there's a gender element and an age element and a sex element, and she gets people to identify their identity and sexuality by placing themselves on this diagram, rather than offering 2 or 3 choices. And it's a very different kind of research, because you have to get people to understand the dimensionality that you're looking at and get to place themselves within these multiple dimensions. So I think there are really interesting movements right now going on, and you can see it in already published papers in a number of the psychology journals, social science journals. You're welcome.
More questions, comments?
There's a tentative hand over there. Yeah.
Thank you again. My question is about the presentation you gave to us. So it was a quite linear development from 1970s to today, and it looks like it was getting better and better, and I do not believe in a world that is getting a better place. So I was just wondering what you think about major backlashes, and if, for example, biofeminists are contributing now relevantly to also these developments in sciences?
That's a great question, because we are obviously both. First of all, I do have to apologize for the focus on the United States, because I was also telling partly my personal history, and this is where this is what I know the best. So a story like this will get told differently in different countries because the timing was different, the legal situation is different, and I think that's very important to note. We are in a moment of backlash in the United States and internationally, and so things that seemed settled are suddenly unsettled. I noticed the abortion question on there. It's about to explode in the United States in a very negative way, and it's not the only thing that will happen, because with this Supreme Court decision that's going to come down, it's likely to affect. It will mean that people will then try to ban birth control. It will mean that they will go after gay and lesbian rights again, and they already are going after transgender children and their ability to get affirmative treatment. So the political battles that got fought and that did seem settled, and they still in some ways I think are settled, and they have changed things, but there's a huge pushback right now, and how far back it will get pushed, what can't be put back in the bottle, I don't, if you think of the feminism as opening the bottle and the genie came out, how much of that can get put back in, I don't know. But there's certainly going to be a massive struggle about it. That's absolutely right. Mm-hmm.
Thank you also from my side, Anne.
You're welcome, Annalise.
A question. In the many, many examples you brought with you, there was not single one comparing women with men, like the old, nice way we know. Women have less whatever as compared to men, or the other way around. And is it that, do you think that we are letting this behind us? The comparative group means here women, here men, here females. There are males, female red versus male red. So are we losing the difference?
I guess I'm not sure what you mean by losing the difference. Are you talking about biological difference? Are you talking about social difference?
Practice of looking for.
Oh, are we looking at the? I think that that yes and no. I think that there are big areas of inquiry where we are losing the practice of looking at difference, and in fact, the newer methods, the ones that use big data kind of agnostically, instead of coming in with a preset notion, but ask how do the data fall out, and when you do that, you find much more continuous kinds of data presentation, and so the practice of then calling those skeletons either male or female, and then assuming that they have certain social locations or social practices, it is changing. It's not gone. I mean, there's certainly still plenty of conventional non-feminist science that gets done. The place where I worry about it the most, actually, is in fields like gender-specific medicine, where there is this, I included it as a positive thing, but there's also a negative thing to it, which is that that it tends to neglect, it tends to emphasize differences, and doesn't really look at areas of overlap. So, do we really need to think of heart disease as different in men and women? Well, it turns out yes, but are there other areas where we don't? Other kinds of disease where really understanding the basic physiology works the same. And maybe gender isn't the relevant factor, maybe body size is the relevant factor, or weight, or diet. So I do think that when you get into the field of medicine and really start worrying about gender-specific medicine, that may develop its own set of blinders that re-emphasizes difference rather than asking what other categories might be important that don't have to do with sex or gender. So I think it's a mixed bag.
Okay, yes. Oh, there's a last question that I take.
Thank you very much. That was thrilling to listen to you. You talked in the end about exposing bad, incomplete science, asking about appropriate methods, filling areas of ignorance, but you didn't talk that much about the technical things, the experimental settings, the laboratory itself, kind of the material side of science. Could you say a little bit more about how feminist science needs to approach the material and kind of the laboratory itself and the experimental setting itself in order to change also the epistemic thing?
So I think that I implied, but I didn't discuss. And I think I focused on methods and statistics, which I consider to be material in a sense that they aren't physical things, but they are the things that you use to manipulate data. And they really matter a lot. Within feminist science itself, there are laboratories that try to organize non-hierarchically. This is very difficult to do, partly because science itself at a national level is organized hierarchically. You have a lab leader who applies for the grant and who, whether you like it or not, has the power to make decisions. And so you have, but you can have better or worse practices within that. Again, Sari van Anders, I think she now has it online, a manual for feminist practice in the laboratory. So there are people who are trying to think through what feminist practice might be in terms of the material practice day to day. There are all sorts of things you could think about. Who does the dishes, literally, versus who does the experiments. I mean, there are many different ways in which the organization of science also matters in how practice is carried out. I didn't think through that in more detail for this talk, I have to say, but I think there is work out there that discusses these questions and thinking about it. And it's happening, there's more thinking now as more of this generation of women who are in their 40s now are rising to have named chairs, are heads of laboratories, and the ones who were especially trained explicitly as feminists. So the other thing that I kind of elided was women versus feminists. So you have women scientists who are not feminists. And even so, I think they tend to think about problems that they've been affected by feminism, whether they want to admit it or not. And so you have that whole question too of how ideology works among women who are practicing scientists as well. So there are several layers of complexity that I absolutely did not address that a sociologist doing a study would want to look at, absolutely.
Okay, I don't want to stop the discussion, but I suggest we switch or shift the discussion outside where the body can participate also differently with some food and drinks and snacks. Before we move out there, I would like to thank Martin Ritzmann. Also, he has been in charge of the technique and of the streaming, and you made it possible that people who are not in this room could also participate. So thanks a lot, Martin. And of course, my last thanks goes back to you, Anne. Thanks so much for having been here, for having given this wonderful talk. And you're all invited to celebrate with us outside of this hall.
That's great. Thank you so much. Thank you all. Thank you.